Hello and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole Anderson, and today we have a little showdown between two very famous pianists, Franz Liszt and Vladimir Horowitz. The focal point is a piece from Liszt's Christmas Tree Suite. Before I get into discussing the Horowitz arrangement of this piece, I'll start with a little background on the original. Actually, I did one of these pieces last year around Christmas, and I had quite a time getting a good take. And that happened again here, actually. I spent an inordinate amount of time on this little piece just trying to make it sound right. It's ironic, really, how sometimes when you have fewer notes, it's much harder to make a piece actually sound good. Liszt is generally known as a great virtuoso, of course, and also a composer of music that's extremely technically difficult, but in his later years he developed a style that was very different, very crystallized, focused. All the excesses from his earlier years were stripped away. The only thing I can compare it to really is trying to play Mozart well. There's a similar kind of economy of means and clarity, and you have to have the same kind of control and restraint to really make it work, even though the music on the surface is very different. So why did Liszt cut back so much in his later music? Well, there are many reasons, but I always look to his personal life, actually, for some inspiration here. Liszt suffered a lot of losses and disappointments in his later life, and much of it, I think, did lead to this kind of reflective and spare nature of his later works. First and foremost, of course, we have to consider the untimely deaths of two of his children. His son Daniel died at the age of 20 in 1859, and his daughter Blandine at the age of 26 in 1862 as postnatal complications. And along with this, right around the same time, there was the frustration of his long-standing desire to marry the Princess Caroline Zusein-Wittgenstein. So that must have added to the depression that at times would just sweep over Liszt in his later years, and which he oftentimes described in letters to friends. His musical practice became a vital method that he used to find solace, but all trace of the exhibitionism or opulence that sometimes were a characteristic of his earlier masterworks completely disappeared. The Christmas Tree Suite was composed for Liszt's granddaughter Daniela, and there are 12 pieces in the collection. It's divided into 3 books of 4 pieces each, and the first 4 pieces are the most standard. They're variants on famous Yuletide carols and songs. The next 4 become more original, more complex, more atmospheric, and the last pieces are the most personal, and particularly the last 3. So this one, Ehemals, as well as the Hungarisch and Polish, they make up a kind of set. Ehemals translates as formerly, I think, is the strict translation, but it basically refers to times of yore, olden times. And here, Liszt appears to have been conjuring up a vision of the very happy days, blissful days, in fact, that he had spent with the Princess Caroline on her estate in Voronezh in Ukraine during 1847 and 1848. This was right at the end of Liszt's great tenure of traveling as a virtuoso performer, and he must have found extraordinary solace with the princess, who was similarly minded, kind of a mystic in a very similar way to Liszt, and really encouraged him in his desires to give up performing and become a composer full-time. Eventually, they kind of grew apart after the failure of their attempts to be married, but they were still very important in each other's lives up until the end, and they corresponded prolifically with each other all the time. So from that perspective, Hungarisch is obviously a tongue-in-cheek self-portrait of Liszt himself, a kind of mini Hungarian Rhapsody, and the Polnisch is an affectionate portrait of the Countess, couched in the form of a mazurka. The Countess was originally Polish. Knowing all this, it's extraordinary, I think, in Ehemals, how strong of an impression we get of how special the princess was to Liszt. The main theme of this work, when it finally blossoms, is so incredibly tender and full of regret and longing. I think his time with her must really have brought a very special kind of beauty and magic into his life. The structure of this piece is also very unique. The piece begins with a fragment. It's a little fragment that's going to be part of the main theme. And it seems as if Liszt is trying to bring some memory into focus, but at first it evades him. We have this kind of very enigmatic motive that just fades away into nothing. Then finally, the main theme takes form, and as I was saying, it's incredibly pure and beautiful. It's the kind of beauty that you experience in your inward eye long after some cherished event. But this idea also breaks off once again, and as I was saying, it's as though Liszt is having very great difficulty bringing back everything he wants to remember. The present, perhaps, is interfering. But finally he does remember, and there's a much longer, impassioned statement of the main theme, which only fades away again after a great deal of development, and then once again the same enigmatic motive from the beginning signals the disappearance of memory. This piece brings back a lot of memories for me too, because it was one of my earliest Liszt pieces that I ever played, and I originally discovered this piece through an informal recording made by Vladimir Horowitz very late in his career. It's just a warm-up recording from a session he was doing for something else. You can hear him kind of casually speaking to other people during the rests, and there's a few wrong notes. But nonetheless, it really fascinated me at the time. It's a very beautiful recording, and actually I still find it to be one of the most successful versions I've ever found of this piece. It, as I was saying, is a very difficult piece to play well. So when I first learned this piece and included it in one of my very earliest concerts, I was probably 14 years old or something at the time, I played Horowitz's version. I figured it out from the recording and I played it. This was not the first time Horowitz had made an arrangement of Liszt's music. Of course, he did many arrangements, particularly of the Hungarian Rhapsodies, but of his various arrangements, this might be the one that I found to be the most instructive to look at and study. The reason for this, of course, brings us back to the extreme difficulty inherent in really getting a successful performance of these late Liszt pieces. When I was preparing this video, I started out simply playing the Liszt original because I thought I would want to go back to it, and I was having a terrible time trying to get a successful take. So in frustration, I dug out the Horowitz recording and I figured it out again and I tried playing that version. Well, of course, my perspective had changed over 20 years or so since I had last played it, and I found that for the most part I tend to prefer Liszt's original, but there are some details about the Horowitz version which are marvelous and, most importantly perhaps, are very helpful. They really helped me in finding the right pacing. And I think pacing is the major problem that I find with these late Liszt works, and maybe the problem that most people have as well, because Liszt cuts back on his texture to such an extreme extent, it can become very difficult to judge tempi accurately when there are so few notes. I think many artists are made very nervous by this kind of austerity and space in the texture, and end up either taking very rapid tempi to kind of counteract that, or even worse, they rush through sections that are particularly spare, losing a lot of the silence and space that Liszt actually intended. It would seem he intended at least to be a focal point for the work. From my perspective, memory should come from silence and reflection, and I think that's what Liszt had in mind as well. So going back to the opening, where Liszt gives an incomplete version of the theme, and he has those enigmatic two-note motives, Horowitz does something actually quite clever here. He adds tiny cadenzas in the silences in between each two-note motive, and these cadenzas are not random, they're based on the octatonic scale, which actually fits in very nicely with the harmonic language of the rest of the piece. Now, obviously, we are losing some of the space and silence of the original in this cadenza elaboration, but from a pedagogical standpoint, this change really helped me to create an inward sense of rhythmic structure in the opening. So after practicing the Horowitz version, I was no longer tempted to shortchange the rests like before, because now I was so used to subdividing. Then again, at the end of the piece, Liszt gradually writes a textural disintegration by decreasing the rhythmic motion from eighth notes to quarter notes kind of gradually. what a lot of people do here is they actually accelerate a lot when the texture moves to quarter notes. They get, again, kind of scared by the austerity of the texture. But listen to what Horowitz puts in here. So as you can hear, he continues to use repeated notes to subdivide this entire section. So he was perfectly aware of this tendency to speed up here, and he realized it was not a good thing to do, so he wrote this in to prevent himself from accelerating more than reasonable. So for myself, I like Liszt's version better here, since you lose this evocative thinning out of the texture with Horowitz's version, but practicing the Horowitz version really cleared up my own interpretive view. And in retrospect, it's kind of obvious. I mean, subdividing in this way, where you actually play a subdivision that's not written in the original, can be very helpful whenever you have a passage like this, which is very spacious and where it's difficult to maintain rhythmic structure. So I think it really shows you how experienced Horowitz was as a musician, and the kind of orchestral framework that he liked to put even in solo music. He actually had a very structured approach to rhythm in the pieces that he played. But again, I think it's a little counter to Liszt's original ideas, and maybe not the best thing to actually leave in. But there are other changes that Horowitz makes that are more subtle and compositionally seem a little bit more well-reasoned, and I find them very hard to resist, actually. So for example, in Liszt's original opening, he includes this appoggiatura. And in Liszt's original piece, this never really occurs again anywhere else, but Horowitz finds several places in the main theme to work in this appoggiatura into the texture, acting as a natural intensification of the theme. So this is really wonderful. It not only ties into the opening, but it also acts as a very natural way of development. And so I wholeheartedly like this change, actually. And there's another really subtle but great change that he makes during the last statement of the main theme. Horowitz adds this little anticipatory dissonance, which is just exquisite. So compare the two versions here. Here's the original. And Horowitz's version. So for me, this really hits the spot, and I feel like Liszt himself would have agreed. Of course, we can never know, but it seems so perfect. And there are other changes that I don't really care for, though. I find that I prefer the intimacy and purity of the original as compared to Horowitz's version. Sometimes Horowitz is a little too quick to kind of soup things up and make them really sumptuous and kind of opulent. And I like the austerity of Liszt's vision in his late pieces, so I might not go for that if I was actually playing these pieces in concert again. I would probably do some kind of a combination and just use those additional appoggiaturas and the little anticipatory dissonance and things like that. However, that's just me. It's a fascinating version. It's well worth being played. You learn a lot from it, just studying it. And it certainly shows ways that would be appropriate to elaborate Liszt's music in other pieces as well. So it's well worth looking at. If you want to use the score that I transcribed, I do provide a link in the description box to where you can download it from my website. So go ahead and take a look at that if you want to play the piece. Keep in mind, Horowitz was partly improvising his version, and so I went ahead and made a few things slightly more consistent about the elaboration in the notation. It's probably nothing that you would even consciously notice unless you were really listening closely, but I think it would make it much easier to learn and to remember. So please be sure to comment below and share what you think about these two versions. Particularly if you disagree with me, I'd be very interested to hear your rationale for what details you like, which ones you think are better, or if you hate both versions, why you don't like it, I'd be very interested to hear that, because I realize that this music is very elusive and very unique, and not everyone is necessarily going to connect to it, at least not at first hearing. So please enjoy the complete performances. Please comment, like the video, subscribe, and have a happy new year. And I'll see you next week for some more great music.